Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Soul Creativity. Nathan here. I'm super excited, as usual, for today's show. And I want to thank everyone who's tuning in either now or tuning in later. The live chat is up, so please feel free to make a comment or ask a question if you're listening live. And I want to welcome today's guest, and I'm so grateful that she's able to join us. I have Maureen Kellen-Taylor, and Maureen is just a fountain of knowledge, and we're going to talk about some exciting topics today. The value of art, which is one of my favorite things, and climate, and connecting to the wild. So we'll see all the subjects we can get through, Maureen. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I'm sure all of our listeners will really gain a lot from what you have to talk about today.
It's my pleasure to join and talk about one of my favorite subjects. But when you said fountain of knowledge, I thought you were going to say fountain of words. I seem to have a lot of those.
I have a lot of those too. But I have to say, every time I've talked to you, I have found you to be a fountain of knowledge. So you may not see yourself like that all the time. Thank you for being here. And I really want to start with something that's important to me, and I know it's important to you as well, is the value of art in human relationships. And I'm wondering if you can talk about that a little bit.
I could talk about that endlessly, but I'll try and narrow it down. I do want to say, first of all, that when I talk about the arts, I'm talking about a very wide idea of what the arts are, including writing, music, performing, culinary arts, as well as the visual. And I'm sure I've forgotten a couple in there. And the other thing I want to address is the fact that we are all creative. I truly believe we are all creative. And when people have argued with me in the past, I've said, well, I understand we have 37 billion cells in our body. Every one of those cells is creative. So how does the whole not be creative? So far, no one's countered that argument. The other thing about the arts is there's a very narrow definition of what or who an artist is. And I think that's a disservice to the world. The idea of an artist is someone, if they're a painter that sold a lot of money and they live on the proceeds of their work. Same for a musician, singer, actor, etc. I don't believe that's so. I think it's useful for some segments of our society to have this narrow definition of art, but it does a disservice for the rest of us. I think the arts come naturally to us. Little kids, even little kids who've never seen a pencil will draw in the dust with a stick, And I think it's all in us and it gets educated out, which really annoys the hell out of me, I have to say. Okay, so that settles that bit, clears my particular perspective. I think the arts are magic, and an example is the way the arts can cross time and space is absolutely magical to me. I had the great good fortune to be in a cave in France a few years back, and looking at these beautiful drawings of animals, it was speaking to me, and I was thinking, this is speaking to me across 17,000 years. Isn't that magic, And so it's exciting to think that we can communicate across the continents and across time using the arts. And the arts have a way of connecting us because they bypass language, and language often puts us in boxes. I know you and I have talked about how the English language is a language of nouns and things in a world that is dynamic and full of verbs, right? And some languages have that. And the arts go into that world where can touch emotions that we're not even sure that we were feeling until we see something or hear something. I'm sure you've had the experience of, cursing the traffic and driving, and then a piece of music comes on and you go, oh yes, I remember that. So I'm sorry, we've got a lot of theatre in our family, and I'm not an actor, but every now and then it does come out a bit. So I've been fortunate to see how the artistic process connects people not only to others with whom they might have nothing in common, but also to aspects of ourselves that we don't remember exist anymore. And how the arts can be healing, they can bring change, as well as I've said, speaking across time and space to others. I'll get on to how we can connect with the more than human world in a moment, but I'd like to tell some stories. And one of the stories that I love is when I was an artist in residence in a San Francisco school, and was teaching language arts. And of course, I love mythology. And whenever I work with kids, I always have to bring gods and heroes and heroines in. And so we were working on heroes and heroines, and the kids were writing stories. One of the classroom teachers came in and told me that one of the boys was terribly upset because he had just seen his father gunned down and killed, and he was a complete mess. And so he warned me that he might act out. What Daryl did, and I still remember his name, was he wrote a story about a superhero. And we loved it so much that we decided to put it on as a play for the rest of the school. And so I watched this little boy, this fifth grader, who had felt so powerless and unable to help or prevent what happened to his father, begin to take on the cloak of a superhero. He starred, of course, in the play, and the rest of the school sat and watched. And we raised money for costumes and scenery, having do-it-yourself monster cupcakes, that sort of thing. But this boy, Daryl, became the superhero and went out in the play, rescuing people and saving people and preventing things from happening. And I saw that he had, although he was still grieving, he had a place where he could go to that was very different from his daily situation. The same with a man who was a quadriplegic and a deaf mute that I worked with, who loved basketball. And we were working together, and he was making collages focused on his favorite basketball team. And I watched this man who could barely move his hands and had to sit in a wheelchair, all of a sudden become these wonderful athletes that he was arranging pictures of and looking at. And so we can, in our imaginations, change who we are, and have opportunities and possibilities that we didn't know. Of course, we couldn't do anything about his physical condition, but we could hold a space where he could be happy and he could imagine. And he did. He had a huge smile that lit up the place. So those are the possibilities that I've seen happen that I think can be applied to our situation now with climate change and pandemics, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. I do want to talk about the way the arts can be useful to communicate. And I had a project. I was funded by the LA Department of Cultural Affairs. And what we were working on was how to mitigate isolation for seniors in senior housing, because isolation for seniors is very, very damaging. their mental well-being and their physical well-being goes downhill. And we had in one of these buildings groups of people that didn't have a language in common. And so my challenge was, how can we change this? Well, when you get to know someone, when you and I met Nathan, we told stories about each other and went, oh yeah, I can identify with that, and make that connection. And so I thought, how can we do that? And so we provided collage and paints and had translators, and the translators would say to the Korean-speaking group, depict a story of some part of your experience. And then the Spanish translator said that to the Spanish speakers. And of course, I said that to the English speakers. And so they made these pictures and put them up with the person's name in their own language in English. And it was very interesting because everyone scrutinized each other's work. And you could see them going, oh, I get that. I understand how that feels. And then they would look and kind of mime to each other and go, yeah, me too. And, oh, you too? It was quite wonderful. And even more so, one of the women, I was told, had dementia and didn't remember any stories. But she did make a painting, and I put that up. And she came and looked at the painting and smiled and nodded. And then she went back to the translator and told her story that she'd remembered. So all these stories, and culture is made up of stories, and we're made up of stories, allowed people to begin to connect with each other. The feedback I got from the staff was that people who are isolated and afraid to come into a social gathering in a room because they didn't know anyone were starting to come in. And even though they couldn't have a long conversation, they would nod and smile and know each other's names. People were beginning to talk in the elevator like, hello, Kai, how are you? Hello, Harry. And they would kind of smile and shake hands. And so there was this feeling of connection that just came from making pictures together. Simple, very simple.
That really makes me think of art as practical magic.
Thank you.
It's like everyday magic that we can use. And the stories you were just telling are interesting because you talked about a young boy in school, and then you were talking about seniors in a housing setting. And so it goes to show you the value of art across all ages. There's not just one particular group or one particular age where it would serve you best. It's really a lifelong, piece of magic that we can use. And it also makes me think about story, which you and I have talked about, and how art tells a story just like it did with the seniors and with the young boy as well. And I think that rewires our brain. You were talking about imagination, and I know there have been a lot of studies done on the brain when you read good literature, and it really, that your imagination makes you think that happened to you. You can go along for the ride, and it actually changes you, like you did do whatever happening in the book or the piece of art. And that's my point. I think art does the same thing. And so you're going to talk about like our connection, how we can connect with each other and even other species. And I think that's part of it, because it really changes the way, and maybe activates our empathy, because we can feel then what somebody else went through, and we all have common experiences, and so it connects us in that way.
Yeah, and when you were talking about the different generations, having putting them together, and one of my favorite projects was a mentoring program with at-risk high school kids and seniors, and the at-risk high school kids all had labels of being problems, and we would match 1-to-1 and they would work together. And they were terribly patient because I would have them doing all kinds of things they'd never done before. So nobody was an expert except for the particular specialist artists that came in. We made stop motion movies, made regular movies. We did performance. We did rapping. And I have to tell you, I don't mean to sound sexist, ageist, or racist or anything, but seeing 80-year-old white women rapping was really a treat. And the kids who were rapping had so much fun with that. And they were playing with each other. And one of the kids came and said, "I didn't know rap was poetry." And I went, "Oh yeah, oh yeah." And at another time, one of the parents came in to see something, to see a movie that his son had written a screenplay for with the help of a couple of seniors and starred in it. And the film actually won a prize in the high school competitions in the area. The filming was done by a professional, but the rest, everybody piled in and did. And I remember the dad came over to me and you could see he was struggling internally because he was trying to make something work in his mind. And he said, "I didn't know my son could do something like that." And I responded, "Oh, yes, he's very creative." But I thought about it afterwards and thought this man had been told for years that his son was a problem, and what value. And of course, he took the professionals as truth. And then everybody got to see that apart from that label, this boy was super creative. He could write, he could act, he could bring people together. And so that's very exciting because then the dad began to see his son differently. The son saw himself differently. And of course, the seniors involved fell madly in love with their mentees. In fact, one of them came and said she was in a store and she heard someone yelling her name. And this guy came racing across and grabbed her and said, "Guess what? Guess what? I've been accepted to architecture college." And she said, This is why I do it, because went from this kid that could barely stay in school to being accepted in college. And I had part of it because I believed in him, is what this woman said. So those, I think, are really important, that bring changes within us. And when we work together, we can use the artistic processes to bring changes or imagine changes, because not only can we look backwards in art, but we can look into the future. And I'm thinking about a project we did. There was a mural that wanted to happen, but all we had was a wall, and a high school student on her iPad had an idea of what the city of Dallas might look like if it was sustainable, if it had solar panels and wind turbines and gardens and trees everywhere. And so what we organized and what I directed was a mural of this called Dallas Dreams. It's what Dallas can be. And the cool thing is it's on a wall in downtown Dallas, so that when you stand, it's very bright, it's like 16 feet long, so you can't miss it. But when you stand in front of it and you see Dallas with all the regenerative power and all the green, and you turn your head to the left, you see Dallas the way it is right now, the same skyline. And all of a sudden the message is coming across, hey, we could do this. We could do this. And without anyone standing there going, we need to do change. The seeds are planted. And I think that having an image like that, it certainly brought a group of activists together to dream the dream of how the city of Dallas could be. But I also think it has and does bring people together who want to make change. And they dream it together. They can do it visually or through music or through literature, performance, all kinds of things. And we see that all around us.
That's really,
pardon me?
I was just going to say that's really beautiful to think of it. I really like the idea of dreaming the change and coming together and, creating a piece of art that displays what that change is. We have a comment and a question I want to read to you, Maureen. And I know we're moving in to talk about climate. And so this is from Ray Peterson, who happens to be a friend of mine. And he said, I'm very interested in how imagination can contribute to addressing climate change. In your experience, what is the most outstanding example of this that you have encountered?
I'm not sure I can give an outstanding example, but I think that one of the things that we suffer, particularly in this culture and in cities, is that we're not in relationship to the natural world, the more than human world anymore. We're taught to look at something long enough to name it and then move on. Little kids, I can remember my daughter discovering grass growing up between the paving stones on a New York Manhattan sidewalk, bending over and getting all excited, saying, look, 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 And we have that capacity when we're kids to see the beauty and amazement, amazing stuff that's all around us. But then, we get educated out of that. And so because we fall out of relationship, how can we fight for something that we don't know about? I know that we do best when we fight for something we love. And I think the arts and imagination can do that. When I teach art, I tell people that I teach them to really look and to also keep that critic that tends to say, what's that supposed to be? At arm's length, give them another job to do. Because I think relearning to look at this amazing, beautiful natural world we're in is incredibly important. I know for myself that, with COVID and heat and storms and things, I have been indoors quite a bit. But in the morning, I get out and I walk under trees and I just feel so much better. It's like a whole new world under trees. And the way the light comes through the leaves and the critters that live in the trees, and the feeling of the air underneath the tree is very different from when you're away from the trees. And so fortunately for me, I fall in love every morning with trees and creeks and things, birds and things like that. I know I sound like a tree hugger, and yes, I am. In my defense, I grew up on the edge of the bush in South America at a time when the wilderness was very close. I mean, we had alligators under our house and monkeys and birds kind of coming in the windows and pinching fruit from the fruit bowls on the table, that sort of thing. Big bugs. And so I was imprinted as a child that I knew more about nature and trees being my best friends at the time than I did about humans. So in terms of climate change, there are so many complex causes of climate change that there isn't one way of fixing it. There's many, many, many different issues that need to be addressed. But we can come together and each pick an aspect that we want to. But my understanding is that, first of all, we have to address our feelings. And when we begin to re-embrace the natural world, then we also have to accept all the damage we've done and are doing, and our hearts break. And that's a big hurdle, because people would rather run away from grief and sadness, and especially if we are, implicated in it, than they would to face it. But we have to face it. And I remember finding out that the saying, laugh and the world laughs with you, cry and you cry alone. And so I grew up with a British family, although I was terribly British, very stiff upper lip and not letting on how upset I was about some of the destruction I saw. And then I met some environmental activists in California and was introduced to something called despair and empowerment groups. And what happened in those groups was that we learned to share what we were despairing, the loss of something we loved, a tree that we grew up with, or a beautiful meadow that's now a parking lot, etc. And once we did that, and we realized that we weren't alone, we were all grieving. Somehow that grief that was we clamped down on and weren't going to let ourselves feel began to shift and change. And at that point, then we could begin to look at each other and explore how we would create changes. And I saw that happen over and over again. And I think that's a really useful way to get around some aspect of the denial. So I'm not sure if I've wandered off the path, Ray. I have no idea if,
No.
if you can.
No, I was
stop going on and get back to the point.
I was thinking about imagination because of Ray's question, and I was thinking how when you are in nature or in the wild, at least I find that your imagination really kicks into gear. And so I can definitely see, and I can't think of an example either of how imagination, led to an actual change, though I'm sure there are plenty of examples out there. But I just really feel strongly that if we allow our imagination to have its place, that's where change begins. And when we combine together, that's really a good way to start bringing some of this, like you were saying, you can start to envision what you want to see, what could happen when we get together, when we use our imagination in those types of situations. We do have another comment from Cynthia.
Before we go on to the comment, I just want to say we do have examples throughout history, probably a very well-known one of someone whose imagination changed the world is Leonardo da Vinci.
Mm-hmm.
I rest my case.
Yeah, that's a very good example. So we have Cynthia Eaton, and she said, could you speak to how the marriage of science, conservation research, and dreaming into local action, an example like a tree planting effort, is helpful?
That's a complex question. So the question is the marriage of science, imagination, and action. I think, first of all, many scientists use their imagination, and then they kind of back up their imagination with data. I can't imagine that you decide to do research without saying, I wonder what would happen if I studied this, this, and this. And the I wonder part, of course, is moving into the imagination. And as far as the action is concerned, we can read all the data we want, but it doesn't really reach our feelings. And the arts get into our imagination and touch our feelings. And we begin to change because of how we feel about something. And once we have that feeling, often we want to do something about it. And if we're in community and we can't think what we can do about it, we can connect with people and say, well, what do you think we can do about it? And then we can imagine together. And then we can come back and say, well, here's science, has research backs up what we're about to do. So there is a marriage. Again, science and the arts have been divided by the way we're educated, where I just see that they interlock. I hope that answers your question, Cynthia. If not, I'm sure we'll have an opportunity um, to unbraid it a bit more. And I'm a little, you have this West Indian sense of time, so I'm never quite sure how much time's going on, or whether I should rush, or whether I should just go, okay, well, just take it the way it goes, man. So.
Well, you can have the time the time you need. I do want to say that Ray said thank you so much for your explanation, and I do. And Cynthia said perfectly. Thank you. So you're doing great. We are getting near the end, but I did want to ask you one other thing that you and I had talked about, and I think that goes along with what we've been discussing is language, and how we might change language to help with all the things we were talking about, like help with art, help with connection, help with climate. And you and I had a discussion before about some of the things in our language that, or words that we keep using that are not beneficial to envisioning change that we want to see.
Yeah, we have to watch for those metaphors. I mean, one of the ones that makes me cringe is killing two birds with one stone. Oh, let's come up with another metaphor for that, because we're doing damage. If we talk about something over and over again, then when the actual bird dies for whatever reason, then it's old news, as it were. But also, again, when we're looking at nature, looking at it beyond our impulse and education to name it and move on. Because you look at a tree and say, oh, yeah, that's a tree. Or even if you're more knowledgeable, that's an oak tree of a particular type, so-and-so, so-and-so, and it grows. But we're not really taking the tree into our imagination. And I think when we connect and really look, and drawing helps me do that. There's an old Zen teaching statement, which is, you sit with what you're going to draw long enough for your souls to intertwine. And I like that a lot, because on so many occasions when I've discovered the amazing way that a petal curls or a leaf shines in the sun, it feels like my soul, my imagination is opening up and it's coming in. And the fact is that if we take something to our imagination, it becomes part of us. And so the more that we get away from language and more into the experience and appreciation and amazement of this magical world around us, then we'll have a better chance of stopping the destruction from it. So I would say to everybody, watch. I heard a very active, very dedicated environmentalist talking about drilling down into a subject. And I thought, whoops, it could be a better metaphor, I think. I think. So
Yeah, that was exactly the kind of things you and I were talking about.
Yeah.
And I think especially creative writers, if you're writing um, in the literary arts, or, whether it's for a play or a screenplay or a novel or a poem, that's where you really have a good opportunity to start changing the language and the images that come along with that. Cynthia thought of another metaphor. How about feeding two flocks with one crust of bread?
Thank you. I'll do that, Cynthia. I like it. And coming
Mm-hmm.
back to what you were saying, I wanted to share something that one of my favorite poets, Rabindranath Tagore, wrote. The way I admire the way poets use language, and the metaphors and the pictures and the way they get into our imagination. And it's one of my favorite ones. And he says, "You are like the flowering tree, amazed when I praise you for your gifts."
That is really nice. I'm sorry, and I didn't catch the name of the poet.
His name is Tagore, Tagore. First name
Okay,
Ravi enough. And
very
of
nice.
course, and Cynthia happens to know a poet. She's married to one who comes up with all sorts of magical ways of describing land and people and birds, and as she does herself. Obviously, Cynthia and I know each other. So
That's very cool. And I should mention that my friend Ray, who was listening in, and his wife um, are both poets as well. So
I hope, Ray, that you'll share some of your poetry. I think poetry is a wonderful bridge between the visual image and and spoken language. Poetry is a wonderful bridge, and I'd love to read some of yours if you put in the chat where I can find your poems. That would be wonderful. Thank you.
yeah, definitely Ray and like I said, his wife Lorinda Lynn, both they amaze me all the time. And Ray said the labeling of species to dismiss it reminds me of Adam in Genesis naming everything as a form of dominism that puts us outside of nature. And that just reminds me of the little story that you wrote when you were a child about Adam. And
Right.
you
Oh,
just
yeah.
told that story where he got to control because he was the one who wrote.
That's right. I decided to rewrite the story of Adam and Eve. Of course, I wasn't very much appreciated by the adults around me, but I had a good time. Adam was counting and naming, and Eve was enjoying and relating, and I think we've got Adam and Eve in both of us for that. We name and count and dismiss, and we have the capacity to relate and enjoy and wonder. Yeah.
Yes. Well, Maureen, this was a fascinating conversation. We could go on for quite a while, as you and I do when we're talking. And so I hope you will come back to Soul Creativity, visit us again, and we can continue some of the subjects that we started. And I know there are plenty of other things that we could talk about as well that are equally important. And so I want to thank you so much for joining us, sharing your knowledge. I want to thank everyone who commented and who is listening in live, and also welcome those who will listen in later. And to please feel free to leave comments after the fact, because I will make sure that Maureen sees them. And I also want to mention that we're talking about activism. Next week's guest is Rivera Sun, and she's an author activist, and she will have, I'm sure, plenty of interesting things to say. So I hope everyone joins in for Rivera next week. And again, Maureen, thank you so much. This was a really inspiring, lively, and important discussion. So thank you. Thanks, everyone, for tuning in. See you next week. Bye.
Thanks for the opportunity.